Hello and welcome to the unseen question. That question cuts to the heart of a problem most people never pause to think through. If you've grown up hearing about God and Satan, you're told from childhood that there's a war between good and evil, heaven and hell, angels and demons. The story is presented as if it's already clear who the winner will be. God is all-powerful, Satan is nothing compared to him, and one day everything will be set right. But there's a problem hiding in that narrative. If God truly is as powerful as believers say, then why hasn't he simply removed Satan already? Believers have been asking that question for centuries, and the answers they've been given don't hold up under even basic scrutiny. Some are framed as deep spiritual insights, others as mysterious parts of a bigger plan. But once you strip away the layers of tradition and look at them with clear eyes, you'll notice they all share one thing in common. They excuse inaction from an all-powerful being while blaming humans for the consequences. Let's start with the most common excuse you'll hear, that God hasn't destroyed Satan because he's testing our faith. The idea goes like this: life is a giant exam. Temptation exists so you can prove your loyalty. Pain and suffering exist so you can show endurance. Satan plays the villain in this test, tempting people towards sin. Without him, the test wouldn't be complete. On the surface, this might sound like it gives life some noble purpose. But look a little closer and the whole logic falls apart. Think about a teacher giving students a math test. The teacher wants to know if the students understand fractions. Fine. But would a good teacher set the classroom on fire and then blame the students if they couldn't concentrate? Would they unleash a wild animal in the room and then call it a fair test? Of course not. A test has rules, boundaries, and fairness built in. If it doesn't, it's no longer a test. It's cruelty disguised as evaluation. And if God is truly all-knowing, he already knows every choice we will ever make. There's no need for a test at all. The test of faith excuse isn't noble. It paints God as a manipulative examiner running experiments on his own creation. Another excuse is that God allows Satan to remain so humans can freely choose between good and evil. This is the so-called free will defense. The story is that if God destroyed Satan, we wouldn't have a real choice. We'd only have goodness, and that would somehow make us robots. But this ignores an obvious fact. You don't need Satan to have free will. Every day you choose between kindness and cruelty, honesty and lies, generosity and greed. None of those decisions require a cosmic devil whispering in your ear. They're just part of living in a world with other people. Think of it this way. If you tell a child not to touch a hot stove, the child can still choose. They can obey or disobey. They don't need a literal villain in the kitchen pushing their hand toward the flame. Free will exists in every decision we make, from the trivial to the life-changing. If anything, the presence of a supernatural deceiver would actually reduce freedom, because it introduces manipulation. Real freedom would be the ability to decide for yourself, without being tricked or pressured by an invisible enemy. Some believers try to soften this argument by saying that Satan's presence makes moral decisions more meaningful. But what does that even mean? Is a child's decision to share their toy less meaningful because Satan wasn't involved? Is an act of love between two people less profound because it didn't involve battling a demon first? The idea collapses under its own weight. Free will doesn't require an evil being. It requires autonomy, responsibility, and genuine consequences for your choices, all of which already exist without invoking Satan at all. A third excuse is that God hasn't destroyed Satan yet because he's waiting for the right time. According to this view, Satan has already been defeated in principle, but God is letting history play out so that everyone can see the contrast between good and evil. It's like watching a movie where the villain is doomed from the start, but the story still drags on for the full runtime. Believers will say this delay proves God's patience and wisdom, but in reality, it paints a disturbing picture. If God knows the end result, why prolong the suffering? Every day of delay means more wars, more famine, more abuse, more injustice. If an all-powerful being is watching it all unfold, able to stop it instantly, yet choosing not to, what does that say about his character? Imagine a firefighter standing outside a burning building saying, I'll rescue the people inside eventually, but first I want to make sure they really appreciate how bad fire is. No one would call that wisdom. They'd call it negligence. If the suffering is preventable yet deliberately prolonged, then patience isn't a virtue. It's cruelty stretched across time. And even if you grant the idea that God wants to demonstrate the full consequences of evil, it's absurd to think we need thousands of years of human misery to get the point. Did we really need the Holocaust to understand cruelty? Do we need another genocide to really grasp the depths of evil? Every person who suffers is not part of a lesson plan. They are real individuals with real lives. To say their suffering is necessary for some cosmic story arc is to strip them of dignity. It treats them as disposable teaching tools, rather than people who deserve compassion and justice. That brings us to the fourth excuse, that Satan's existence somehow glorifies God. The argument here is that without evil, people wouldn't truly appreciate goodness. In this view, darkness makes the light brighter, pain makes joy sweeter, and Satan makes God's mercy more impressive. It's a strange way of justifying suffering, and it makes God look less like a benevolent creator and more like a manipulative showman. Think about it. Do you need to be tortured to appreciate comfort? Do you need to starve to value food? Do you need to experience betrayal to recognize love? Life is full of contrasts already: happiness and sadness, health and sickness, peace and conflict. None of these require an immortal villain orchestrating chaos. To say that evil must exist for good to be meaningful is like saying, we need arsonists so we can appreciate firefighters. It's backwards logic. Goodness has intrinsic value. You don't need to see the worst atrocities in history to recognize the worth of kindness, compassion, or joy. The idea that God needs Satan to show off goodness makes God dependent on evil for his own glory, which contradicts the whole claim that he's perfect and self-sufficient. Finally, there's a fifth excuse, that God's ways are mysterious, beyond human understanding. This one often comes up when all other explanations fail. Believers will say, we can't know why God allows Satan to exist, but we just have to trust that it's for the best. On the surface, this can feel humble, but it's actually a way of shutting down thought. It discourages questions, silences doubt, and leaves people with a blind acceptance of suffering. And notice what it really does. It admits there's no logical explanation, then demands you accept it anyway. When people say God's ways are mysterious, they're essentially saying, don't think too hard about it. But imagine applying that to anything else in life. If a doctor let your illness worsen for years and then said, you'll never understand why I didn't treat you, but trust me, it's for the best, would you accept that? Or would you look for a new doctor? In every other area of life, we demand reasons, accountability, and transparency. But when it comes to theology, we're told that ignorance itself is a form of faith. When you look closely at these 5 excuses, the test of faith, free will, waiting for the right time, glorifying goodness, and divine mystery, they all fail in the same way. They try to explain suffering without ever questioning the assumptions at the root of the story. They assume God exists, that he's good, that Satan is real, and that human suffering must somehow serve a higher purpose. Once those assumptions are locked in place, believers are forced to invent complicated rationalizations for why the world looks exactly like it would if no such being existed in the first place. This is the key point people often overlook. If God were truly all-powerful and perfectly good, the continued existence of an immortal enemy makes no sense. But if God doesn't exist, or if the stories about him are myths, then the picture suddenly becomes very clear. Evil exists because humans are capable of it. Suffering exists because of natural causes, human choices, and systems of power. Satan doesn't need to exist for cruelty, injustice, or pain to exist. People are more than capable of creating those things on their own. Consider how the idea of Satan has been used historically. In the Middle Ages, natural disasters were often blamed on the devil. If a disease spread through a town, it wasn't poor sanitation or lack of medical knowledge. It was Satan at work. If crops failed, it wasn't drought or soil exhaustion. It was the devil. And if someone stepped outside the social or religious norms, they were accused of being in league with him, The belief in Satan gave people an easy scapegoat, but it also led to witch trials, executions, and mass hysteria. When we attribute problems to a cosmic enemy, we often miss the real causes and the real solutions. The persistence of these excuses shows how deeply people want their worldview to make sense, even when it doesn't. It's uncomfortable to admit that the God you've been taught to worship doesn't act logically or compassionately. So the mind builds defenses, explanations, and stories to protect that belief. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the tension between belief and evidence. When people face contradictions, they often resolve the tension not by changing their beliefs, but by twisting reality to fit them. That's why the same flawed excuses keep repeating generation after generation. And there's another layer to this. These excuses don't just distort people's understanding of the world, they also shape how people live. Take the test of faith excuse. If you believe life is a test set up by God, then suffering becomes something to endure silently, instead of something to challenge or change. If you think poverty is part of a divine trial, you may be less motivated to fight against inequality. If you think illness is a test of endurance, you may be less likely to demand better healthcare or medical research. By framing suffering as part of a cosmic test, religious thinking can discourage real progress. The free will excuse has similar effects. If Satan's presence is necessary for free will, then every act of evil can be shrugged off as just part of the plan. It makes human cruelty seem like a background necessity rather than something we must confront. Think about the way some communities react to tragedies. A natural disaster destroys homes, and survivors are told it was Satan's work. But if everything bad can be blamed on a supernatural villain, then who is left accountable? It allows people in power to ignore the real problems that caused the disaster to be so devastating: poor infrastructure, corruption, or lack of planning. Blaming Satan is easier than fixing what's broken. And then there's the idea that God is waiting for the right time. That excuse has led to endless predictions of the end of the world. For centuries, believers have claimed that we're living in the last days. In the year 1000, thousands believed the apocalypse was imminent. In the 1800s, movements like the Millerites sold everything they had because they thought Christ was returning that year. More recently, we've seen televangelists predicting exact dates for the end times. Every single one of those predictions has failed. Yet people keep waiting. They keep excusing the delay, and the world keeps turning. The excuse that evil glorifies God is perhaps one of the most disturbing. It has been used to justify some of the worst suffering in history. After earthquakes or hurricanes, you'll sometimes hear preachers say that the disaster was part of God's plan to show His power. After tragedies like school shootings, some claim that the pain will ultimately bring people closer to God. But when you really listen to those claims, they sound cruel. They turn human tragedy into a marketing tool for religion. They take moments of unbearable grief and twist them into opportunities to say, "Look how much we need God." That's not compassion, that's exploitation. And then there's the mystery defense, perhaps the most convenient of them all. Anytime a believer feels cornered by logical questions, they can retreat to mystery. But the more you think about it, the more obvious the problem becomes. Mystery isn't an explanation. It's the absence of explanation. It's an admission that the worldview doesn't make sense, dressed up as humility. And when people stop at mystery, they stop asking better questions. They stop looking for real answers. They stop challenging traditions that may be harming them. Once you recognize these excuses for what they are, you start to see a pattern. They all protect the image of God at the expense of reality. They shift the burden of suffering away from divine responsibility and onto human shoulders. If there's pain, it's because you failed the test. If there's evil, it's because free will demands it. If suffering drags on, it's because God has a plan you can't see. In every case, the responsibility of a supposedly all-powerful being is avoided, while humans are left to carry the weight. But here's the striking thing. Even without invoking God or Satan, we actually do have the tools to understand why suffering exists. We know that natural disasters come from tectonic activity, climate patterns, and human vulnerability. We know that disease spreads because of biology, germs, and sometimes poor public health systems. We know that wars and injustice come from greed, inequality, and human choices. We don't need to imagine an invisible devil to explain any of this. The world makes sense without those supernatural stories, and when we see the world clearly, without leaning on excuses, we're free to actually solve problems. If disease is caused by germs, we can create vaccines. If poverty is caused by inequality, we can design fairer systems. If violence is caused by hatred, we can challenge the beliefs and structures that fuel it. None of that requires waiting for God to destroy Satan. It requires us to act, to think, to take responsibility. The excuses only hold people back from taking that responsibility. There's also a psychological angle that makes these excuses so persistent. Humans crave certainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, especially when it involves big questions like the meaning of life or the existence of evil. If someone grows up being told that God is loving, but then experiences terrible suffering, the mind faces a contradiction. How do you reconcile those two realities? One way is to abandon the belief. Another way, the way most people find less frightening, is to invent or accept excuses that maintain the belief. That's why the same tired explanations keep resurfacing, even when they're logically weak. They soothe the discomfort of not knowing. Take the idea of God waiting for the right time. It's essentially a psychological defense mechanism. It shifts the burden of explanation into the future. You don't have to face the contradiction now because one day it will all make sense. But of course, that day never comes. It's a perpetual delay, a promise that can never be tested, because the evidence is always just around the corner. And for many believers, that promise is enough. It relieves the pressure of unanswered questions, at least temporarily. Another important factor is authority. For centuries, religious leaders have been the gatekeepers of meaning. They've controlled how people interpret suffering, disasters, and evil. When a priest or pastor says, "This is Satan at work," or "This is God's mysterious plan," the community often accepts it without question. Not necessarily because the explanation makes sense, but because it comes from a figure of authority. Social psychology shows us how powerful this effect is. Experiments like Stanley Milgram's obedience studies revealed that people will often go along with harmful actions simply because someone in authority told them to. The same principle applies here. If a trusted leader insists that suffering has a divine reason, many people accept it, even when their own intuition says otherwise. But there's a cost. When authority dictates meaning, individuals stop trusting their own reasoning. If you feel deep down that something is unjust, but you're told it's part of God's plan, you're forced to suppress your moral instincts. Over time, that can dull people's sense of responsibility. It can normalize suffering instead of pushing people to challenge it. And that's one of the most damaging outcomes of these excuses. They condition people to accept what should never be acceptable. Look at history for examples. During slavery in the Americas, many slaveholders justified the practice by appealing to Scripture. They argued that slavery was part of God's design, that the suffering of enslaved people would ultimately serve a greater purpose. Some even claimed it was Satan tempting abolitionists to disrupt the divine order. These were excuses, theological justifications used to preserve a system of cruelty. And because they were backed by religious authority, they held enormous power. Generations of people accepted injustice that should have been unthinkable, all because they were told it fit into a cosmic story about God and Satan. The same dynamic plays out in personal tragedies. When someone loses a loved one, they might hear, "God needed another angel," or "Satan is attacking your faith." These statements might be intended as comfort, but they actually trivialize grief. They reduce a complex, painful human experience to a plot point in a spiritual drama. And instead of encouraging people to seek healing, community support, or even therapy, these excuses push them to simply accept their pain as part of a larger, untouchable plan. The result is that people often feel silenced in their grief, unable to fully process their emotions because questioning would feel like doubting God. Now, think about what happens when these excuses are applied at the societal level. When disasters strike, some leaders claim they're acts of God's judgment or Satan's activity. After hurricanes, floods, or earthquakes, It's not uncommon to hear religious voices blame the suffering on society's sins or on the devil's influence. But this kind of thinking distracts from the real, solvable issues. Hurricanes cause less destruction in areas with strong infrastructure. Earthquakes are less deadly in places with proper building codes. But if you believe the devastation was Satan's work, you may overlook the fact that better planning and resources could have saved thousands of lives. The excuse creates passivity where action is desperately needed. Even the so-called mystery defense has dangerous consequences. When people are told that God's ways are beyond understanding, they may stop asking hard questions about injustice, corruption, or violence. Instead of holding leaders accountable, they resign themselves to the idea that suffering is part of an incomprehensible plan. But history shows that every major advance in human rights, medicine, and science came from people refusing to accept mystery as an answer. They asked questions, challenged assumptions, and sought real explanations. Without that drive, we'd still be attributing disease to demons and eclipses to angry gods. All of this leads to an uncomfortable but important realization. The excuses for why God hasn't destroyed Satan don't just fail logically. They also function as tools of control. They keep people in line, discourage dissent, and prevent change. If you believe that suffering is necessary for God's glory, then you won't resist it. If you believe that Satan must exist for free will, then you'll accept evil as inevitable. If you believe God's timing is mysterious, then you won't demand answers now. Each excuse keeps people waiting, enduring, and obeying instead of questioning, challenging, and acting. But once you step outside that framework, the picture shifts. Evil and suffering are not mysteries, they're problems. They're problems that humans can study, understand, and address. We've already made enormous progress doing exactly that. We've reduced child mortality, extended lifespans, built systems of justice, and created technologies that improve quality of life. None of that required destroying a supernatural villain. It required curiosity, compassion, and human effort. The story of God versus Satan doesn't explain the world we live in. It distracts us from it. So why hasn't God destroyed Satan yet? The honest answer is likely the simplest. Because the story itself isn't true. Satan persists because people keep telling the story. The excuses exist not to explain reality, but to protect belief. And as long as the belief is protected, the excuses will keep circulating no matter how weak they are. The real challenge isn't figuring out why God hasn't acted. The real challenge is asking why so many people accept excuses in place of answers. One aspect we haven't looked at yet is how the idea of Satan actually benefits religious institutions. If Satan vanished from the story, many teachings would lose their urgency. Fear of hell, fear of temptation, fear of being deceived. All of these depend on having an enemy to blame. Without Satan, a lot of religious control mechanisms weaken. Think of how often preachers frame life as a battle between God and the devil. It's a narrative that keeps people emotionally invested. It makes every choice feel cosmic, every mistake feel dangerous, every doubt feel like a risk to your soul. Satan isn't just a character in the story. He's the fuel that keeps the engine of fear running. The irony is that this villain who supposedly explains evil also explains away the failures of the faith itself. If prayers go unanswered, Satan is blocking them. If the church loses members, Satan is deceiving them. If someone finds contradictions in Scripture, Satan is confusing their mind. No matter what happens, the story still works because Satan fills the gaps. That's why his existence is never seriously questioned inside religious systems. He's too useful. He gives the faithful an enemy to rally against, and he shields God from blame. It's a convenient setup, but convenience is not truth. Sociologists have long noted that when groups feel threatened, they often create or exaggerate an external enemy. It unites the group, strengthens loyalty, and justifies sacrifices. Nations at war use propaganda for this purpose. Cults do the same by warning members about outsiders. Religion does it by painting Satan as the ultimate enemy. But unlike political or cultural enemies, Satan can never be defeated. He's eternal, invisible, and always working. That makes him the perfect tool for endless loyalty. You can never say, "The battle is over, we've won." The struggle must continue, which means obedience must continue. When you see it that way, the question of why God hasn't destroyed Satan starts to look less like a mystery and more like a feature of the system. Another angle worth considering is how this shapes morality. When evil is externalized into a figure like Satan, it encourages people to see morality as a cosmic tug-of-war instead of a matter of human choice and responsibility. If you lie, cheat, or harm someone, you can say Satan tempted you. If you do good, you can say God inspired you. But where are you in that equation? The individual becomes a pawn rather than an agent. That outlook can stunt moral growth because it discourages people from owning their decisions. True moral responsibility means admitting that cruelty and kindness both come from within us, not from invisible forces pushing us around. This has real-world consequences. In criminal justice, for instance, there are cases where perpetrators of violence claim they were under demonic influence. Sometimes these defenses even get taken seriously. In less extreme cases, everyday harmful behavior gets dismissed with, "The devil made me do it." But that mindset denies accountability. It turns ethical reflection into a blame game. And in a society already struggling with responsibility and justice, excusing actions through invisible villains only makes matters worse. There's also the question of scale. If Satan is responsible for everything from personal temptations to global disasters, then his power rivals God's. That raises an uncomfortable contradiction. How can Satan have so much influence in a world supposedly governed by an all-powerful being? The usual answer is that Satan is on a leash, permitted to act within boundaries God allows. But that only deepens the problem. If God is the one holding the leash, then every evil act is indirectly permitted. Every tragedy, every abuse, every atrocity, all of it happens under divine supervision. That makes God less like a rescuer and more like an overseer who occasionally steps in but mostly watches. This is why the excuses collapse under scrutiny. They don't clarify anything. They only protect an idea that doesn't hold up. When you step back and look at the world, it's clear that evil exists because humans are capable of it, and suffering exists because of natural processes we're still learning to manage. We don't need a cosmic villain to explain any of it. And we don't need to wait for a divine savior to fix it. We have the responsibility and the ability to confront it ourselves. The truth is, the longer people cling to these excuses, the longer they delay that responsibility. If you believe Satan is behind disease, you might pray instead of funding research. If you believe disasters are divine lessons, you might ignore the need for better infrastructure. If you believe suffering is a test, you might accept injustice instead of resisting it. Excuses don't just distort understanding, they shape action, or inaction, in ways that keep the world harsher than it needs to be. So when someone asks, "Why hasn't God destroyed Satan yet?" the most honest response is that the question itself is misplaced. It assumes a story that doesn't fit reality. It assumes there's a God who could intervene, and a Satan who needs to be defeated. But if you look at the evidence, what you see is a world shaped by natural forces and human choices. No invisible villain, no cosmic leash, just us, navigating the consequences of our actions and the challenges of the planet we live on. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." That idea may sound daunting because it leaves us without a divine safety net. But it's also liberating. It means we're not waiting for someone else to fight our battles. It means the responsibility and the power lies in our hands. The excuses don't just fail logically, they hold us back from realizing what we're actually capable of. And maybe that's the real tragedy of the Satan story. Not that it's false, but that it convinces people to sit and wait instead of standing up and acting. Evil isn't a mystery, and it isn't a test, it's a challenge. One that humans have been tackling step by step with science, compassion, and cooperation. And the more we do that, the clearer it becomes. We don't need excuses. We need solutions. And we don't need God to destroy Satan, because there was never a Satan to begin with.